Okay, well, welcome, folks. I'm Rob Greenwood, Executive Director of the Harris Center at Memorial University, and delighted to host this Synergy session. My colleague, Mike Clare, Associate Director of the Public Policy of the Harris Center, normally handles these, but he's away at a conference at the moment. And it's my pleasure because I've partnered with Ratna Chuampunje and her team on Too Big to Ignore numerous times. So it's a great opportunity to get back together. We have a room full of people here in the education building in St. John's. We also have a room of people at our Grenfell campus in Corner Brook. And we have people joining us via the web in their own locations, wherever they may be around the world. This is also an adventurous Synergy session. They're all adventurous in content, and we always webcast, but this one we're going to combine it with breakout group discussions, which I don't know if we've ever done in the 12 years of and more of the Harris Center. So it's going to be lots of fun, but I think the technology is now cooperating. I'm going to use very little time for intro, and we'll get right into the meat of it. So this session is on implementing the small-scale fisheries guidelines, what's in it for Newfoundland and Labrador. Ratna will lead off. She's Canada Research Chair in Natural Resource Sustainability and Community Development. Could you pick a more important chair for the province of Newfoundland and Labrador and many locations around the world? And she is Professor of Geography at Memorial University. She leads a partnership project called Too Big to Ignore, which conducts research and capacity development to promote the sustainability of small-scale fisheries around the world. And the other hat I wear at Memorial is Executive Director of Public Engagement. And Ratna is one of the many examples, but she's certainly one of our superstars, of engaged research and engaged teaching and learning, where we partner with the community, with government, with labor, with other organizations. Because we have lots of expertise in the university, but there's lots in the community, and we want to make sure we work together for our mutual advantage. And so thank you, Ratna, for always being a leader in that area. We also have two colleagues from part of Ratna's team worldwide. Micah Brower and Sarah Potter are visiting undergraduate students from Van Hal Larenstein University of Applied Sciences in Leeuwarden, the Netherlands. Hopefully I didn't fool that up too badly. They're working with the Too Big to Ignore project to conduct research in Newfoundland and Labrador about the SSF guidelines. And we're going to learn a lot more about them now from Ratna. And then she will hand it over to Micah and Sarah. And then my colleague Taylor Stocks from the Harris Center will introduce you to the breakout group go forward plan and nuts and bolts. And I'm going to play my favorite role, which is time manager, which I do ruthlessly to make sure that we have lots of opportunity for Q&A at the tables, in the room is in plenary, and then the report back at the end. So over to Ratna.
Thanks so much, Rob. It's a real pleasure to again join Harris Center in this Synergy session. Thanks to Rob and Taylor and also Mike Clare for hosting the Synergy session with us today. So it is an important opportunity for us, I believe, to talk a little bit more about small-scale fisheries, situating that in the context of Newfoundland. So even though the project is global, but we are based at Memorial University, and we have been working with quite a few of you here in this room to talk about the importance of small-scale fisheries for food security, for sustainability, and for employment and revenues and etc. So today the focus is going to be about the guidelines, which you would have a copy of. And if you were part of our research in terms of the study that Sarah and Mike did, you would already been interviewed by it perhaps. But even if you're not, what we are trying to do today is basically introduce you to what the guidelines are about and then share with you some of the preliminary results of our research. And more importantly, we'd like your input and feedback in terms of what is it going to take for Newfoundland to really take advantage of what these guidelines has to offer. So you may be familiar with the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries. This is an instrument, international instrument that FAO facilitated a conversation, and it was adopted since 1995. So until this year, we have something that is particular, specific to small-scale fisheries. What took us so long? In a sense, maybe the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries would be enough to take care of small-scale fisheries, but we actually don't believe so, simply because there are many aspects of small-scale fisheries that really require uh, careful attention. Something like this is statistics like this always speak to why we need to pay attention to small scale fisheries. We're basically talking about 90% of the people involved in fisheries that are small scale, but yet we don't have a way to really integrate their importance or recognize their importance and contribution in the way that it should. And what is important to note for us is that when people think about small-scale fisheries or inshore fisheries, they might think that is something to do with the developing countries or in the south. But as we know, in Newfoundland, we do have small boat fisheries operating, and they're playing an important role to the economy and to the culture of Newfoundland. So around the world, we know that we need to really recognize that they exist in the majority and also making a lot of contribution. But for the most part, they have been largely ignored and marginalized because of their geography or because of their economic and political power. So the guidelines are, in a sense, there in order to address some of these concerns and recognizing that we have to find a different way to approach small scale fisheries and really pay attention to their needs and their concerns and also help bring out their contributions in a way that really can really produce the kind of benefits to the overall society. So the guidelines are basically a negotiated international instruments. It's a long process of developing these. It kind of started in 2008 when the civil society organizations requested to FAO to have a conference to talk about small scale fisheries. So that conference took place in Bangkok 2008, and that's kind of like the start of the conversation. And then FAO convened many consultations, many expert workshops to draft these guidelines. So the process took several years, actually, and a consultation with 4,000 people around the world to talk about, what are important to include in the guidelines, what kind of principles should be part of this. So, and then the important part about the guidelines, if you were to look in details, you would see that when we talk fisheries, it's never about fisheries. It's always about everything else that concerns coastal communities. So there will be issues in the guidelines that relate to livelihoods, to social security, to other opportunities within the coastal communities that small-scale fishing people are engaged in and also could contribute to economic development and others. Um, so the guidelines were not developed in isolation of other instruments that are already there. For instance, it speaks a lot to the responsible fisheries, the code of conduct. It also speaks to the right to food guidelines and also the tenure guidelines. So those, so they are consistent, if you like, with other instruments that are happening already and that have been endorsed and adopted by governments. So one thing that we really need to note is that there's a reason why the guidelines speak directly to human rights and a human rights based approach to govern fisheries, simply because it's an important recognition in terms of small scale fishing people do have tenure rights to their livelihoods, to their tradition and their culture and etc. So we could use the human rights based approach in order to help emphasize their importance and their need. So that is something that is quite unique about these guidelines. So there are three parts to the guidelines, and again, you have copies on your desk, and we would have more conversation about them. And you may have already seen some of these in the guidelines at a glance, and you may have a copy of. But basically, it's just like any instrument, it has some preamble, some introduction, some terms and principles that need to be discussed, and then it talks about the essence of it, which is various aspects that need to be part of the conversation when we talk about the guidelines. And then the third part of the guidelines, the document, is actually about implementation. So you can see that all of a sudden we kind of jammed in quite a few things into this one document and an instrument. And now it will be up to people to try to implement them. So who are these people that we need to implement, and how are we going to implement them is something that we're inviting you here to have a conversation about. So topics like governance of tenure, social development, value chain and trade, gender equality, disaster risk are the key paragraphs in those guidelines, same as how to structure the governing bodies in ways that could have policy coherence, that we have to do more in terms of research information, capacity development, and others. So those are the kind of things that need to be part of the conversation. So just some, a few minutes on the guide, on the principles itself. Again, the guidelines are different from others in the sense that because of the recognition that small-scale fisheries are not just about fishing, but about many other things, the social side of things that are happening in the community. So we have to bring in principles or introduce these principles that really speak to many things that small-scale fisheries are about. And you would hear a little bit from the research that we conducted in terms of the relevance of these principles according to the participants of the research that we engage with. But they really speak to a much broader picture. They cover a large, many aspects that need to be part of the conversation about the sustainability of small-scale fisheries and also the viability of the small-scale fishing people. So it places small-scale fisheries. The guidelines do the following job, right? It places small-scale fisheries in the context of human rights, which is something that it hasn't not been done before, but that's what the fishing people, the civil society organizations, again, it's a grassroots development of the guidelines. It's not FAO going to the communities and saying that you need to do this. It's the communities and organizations at a grassroots level that say we need these kind of guidelines. So they speak directly to the rights issues, whether it's tenure rights and rights to livelihoods and right to food. So those are part of these. The principles and guidance in there, which would have like a framework of action for stakeholders in order to help implement the guidelines, is supposed to help empower small-scale fishing communities in order to participate in decision-making process. And that is one of the key principles about the guidelines. So we need to have conversation about how to facilitate that, how to make that happen, that small-scale fishing people can really be part of that decision-making process, and then assume that responsibility to sustainable fisheries resources. And of course, there is a strong emphasis, especially on groups that are marginalized and groups that are most vulnerable. And you'll see when we talk about climate change in other contexts, they are the most vulnerable because some of them are living in a very small islands. And so we would have conversation about whether some of the topics that are included in the guidelines are really relevant or not. But you can imagine around the world, we have places where small-scale fishing people are quite vulnerable and marginalized. But the most important thing is that now that the guidelines have been adopted in 2014, came up, and basically what it means by adopting the guidelines, it's at the COFI. This is a committee in fisheries. So the meeting took place every 2 years, and on the agenda in 2014 was the guidelines. So the member states that participated in the COFI, basically all fisheries countries around the world, I think it's like 200 members are part of that, but for fisheries, there might be a bit like 170 some. So people who were there made, and basically go through these guidelines and adopted the guidelines as part of the basically adopting that as part of the government agreeing that these guidelines should be part of the conversation and the policy that needs to take place. But the implementation of the guidelines is really up to each country because it's voluntary, right? So basically, we agree in principle that the guidelines are useful and good to have, but now how to implement it is the next step. And this is something that we are very much into right now. So now that the guidelines have been adopted, what to do in order to implement the guidelines, how to really motivate and mobilize people and engage with groups in order to help implement the guidelines is something that each country is doing right now. So we have, for instance, Costa Rica have already written new policy in the fisheries that are corresponding to the guidelines. Indonesia is doing the same thing. So many countries around the world are mobilizing and talking and having conversation about how to really implement the guidelines. And this is something that we are hoping that it would happen also in Canada. So a lot of things that need to happen. And this is basically what we are doing in the Too Big to Ignore project. We have been engaging in the development of the guidelines in terms of drafting the guidelines in the earlier draft and providing input. And in particular, one of our members, our leaders in the project has involved even in the negotiation of the guidelines. So basically representing the government of Norway in working through the text in the guidelines and doing that adoption and endorsement. So the Too Big to Ignore project, actually Harris Center is partner to us, the Marine Institute is partner to us, and other FAO and other partners around the world. But it's an open network. So we actually would invite people interested in the project to, there's some information that you can pick up about the project. So if you are interested in being part of the network, you're most welcome to join. And everybody can do exactly the same thing as what we are trying to do with this, which is, looking at research, looking at mobilizing community, looking at supporting small-scale fishing communities around the world. What we are doing in the Too Big to Ignore is quite broad because there are many, many aspects of fisheries and small-scale fisheries that we pay attention to. But in particular, you will see that we have one cluster that is about the guidelines. And basically, our leader, Sven Jentoft at the University of Tromsø, actually it's a new name, it's an Arctic University. I don't remember the full name now, Arctic University in Tromsø. Basically, he presented this paper that is it is titled Walking the Talk, to just, trying to reflect his own experience being part of the process and also set the stage for the kind of research that would be provided in order to help implement the guidelines. So what you'll be hearing next is basically part of that research that we're doing in order to help implement the guidelines. And this whole process is also part of what we need to do in order to help implement the guidelines in Canada. We basically are doing what we call unpacking exercise, trying to get into understanding, what would be something that could provide opportunities to implement the guidelines, what are something that might be factors and conditions that might need to be looked at because they're not consistent, for instance, with what's going on in the way we think about fisheries here in Canada. So you see that we are going to be looking at around the world, and Newfoundland. For now, at least, I should have put Canada, but then Newfoundland, in a sense, fisheries, Newfoundland is Canada, for me at least. So we're going to be looking at learning as much as we can from you and from the experience that we have here. And then hopefully, if things go well from today, we probably would do a little bit more of the cross-country consultation to other parts of Canada in the future. But our hope would be that we're doing this as part of our research, and we're going to contribute to this book, so we can have a chapter about Newfoundland and experience that we learn here through this process. But eventually, we would like to see these as a national level, at least like an implementation and a strategy and a plan. And this is something that we hope to work closely with the Harris Center to trying to facilitate, and hopefully we will be able to see sustainable small-scale fisheries in Newfoundland and Canada and around the world. Now I would pass on to the research. This is the exciting part of what we're doing.
Anna, for the interesting talk about the guidelines, and thank you to the Harrison Center for giving us a platform today to present our research. Well, Sarah is getting prepared over there now, and Maike, and we have done research on the opportunities and challenges of during our short presentation. We will give you the purpose of our study. So why have we done this study? What was our aim? We will give you a short scope of our research. So what have we done so far to approach our question? And then we will dive into the preliminary results concerning about the awareness of stakeholders about the guidelines. Do they know the guidelines? Are the guidelines suitable for the province? Do people see the relevance of the guidelines, and can they see benefits? And then we ask people also if they can point out aspects which can facilitate or be an obstacle for the implementation of the guidelines. And then, of course, we give you a small conclusion about our preliminary results. Okay, why have we done the study? Ratana presented the guidelines to you and expressed its value and their necessity. And we were interested if these guidelines could also be an opportunity in Canada, especially in Newfoundland, where the inshore fisheries, the small-scale fisheries, is the backbone for rural communities. And therefore, we asked if these people, if stakeholders within the fisheries, but also outside the fisheries, could outline why these guidelines could be relevant for the province and if they can see benefits of these guidelines. And also, we were interested if they can point out some factors which they see as facilitating for the implementation process. And also if they can point out structures or situations where they see this could be an obstacle for the implementation. And also we were interested if they can point out certain steps that could be taken towards a successful implementation already. Just shortly, what have we done so far? So as I mentioned, we did interviews with stakeholders inside and outside the fisheries sector, and we did 35 in total. So we aligned our 35 interviews to 3 different stakeholder groups. We interviewed fish harvesters, inshore fish harvesters, of course, governmental actors such as members from the DFO, DFA, and the FFAW, the Fisheries Union, and also we did interviews with scientists, NGOs, and civil society organizations. And as you can see on the map here on the right, we covered a broad geographical scope of the island. So we did interviews in the northern peninsula, in communities such as Port Sanders or Port au Choix, and we also have been to the eastern side of the island, to Petty Harbour, St. John's, or Bay de Word. Okay. So before we go into the actual content of the guidelines and to the relevance, I would like to talk with you about the awareness factor. Awareness is an important step towards the implementation and towards a common approach to the guidelines. And therefore, we were interested if all stakeholders we have interviewed do actually know the guidelines, if they have heard about them. And as you can see on the chart, 51% of our interviewed people have never heard about the guidelines before. And 49% have, so it's equally divided. But what was interesting during our interview session, we couldn't really get it clear if people actually have a in-depth knowledge about the guidelines, or if they just they're saying they've heard about it. And to be prepared for that and having a decent conversation about the guidelines, we presented the guidelines to them like Ratana just did to you, so that they can actually point out relevance or benefits of the guidelines. All right, and now Sarah's taking over.
Thank you. And after we discussed or explained the guiding principles to the interviewees, we asked them to outline the most relevant principles for them. And those are the 3 most mentioned ones. It's the principle of consultation and participation, the principle of economic, social, and environmental sustainability, as well as the principle of social responsibility. And now I would like to outline the benefits that the small-scale fisheries guidelines have. So part of our findings were that the guidelines could help to identify and address certain issues, as for example, recruitment. As I guess you are aware of that, the fishing population in Newfoundland is aging, so the average fisherman would be 50 plus. And it's especially hard for younger people to get into the fisheries business. Additionally, the guidelines address communication and participation issues, which would include or should include stakeholders more in the participation process by creating an enhanced collaboration of all levels and actually based on existing co-management structures. And then we have enhancement of economic viability. For example, meaning that the shift from quantity to quality leading to a better product that could reach higher prices on a market could be one point, but this would not only lead to a change in fishing technology, also to a change in the post-harvest sector. And then in the end, it could be that this factor is making the sector more attractive also to younger people to enter the fisheries. Now, after I've outlined some of the benefits of the small-scale fisheries guidelines, we will have a look on factors and conditions that could or would facilitate an implementation based on our findings. So our interviewees outlined that they do have faith in the new Liberal government. We don't know how it is after the government outlined your financial situation, but they said that the new Liberal government might be willing to change the fisheries situation. Furthermore, existing structures, such as, for example, fishing corporations, as the one in Petty Harbour or on Fogo Island, can be used, and that the FFAW is acting as a united voice for fishermen. Furthermore, the knowledge exchange between fish harvesters and science was mentioned, so meaning that fishers can participate in research surveys, but it was also outlined that they want to be included even more, so that they are willing to participate even more. Another point was the initiatives of fish harvesters to manage their resource sustainable. And for example, the community in Trout River is caring about their fish in the water, and they are managing their resources sustainable. And last but not least, an important point, the willingness of stakeholders. It seemed that all our stakeholders that we interviewed are willing to implement the guidelines and that they see the importance of the earlier outlined guiding principles. So, however, there are also challenges and obstacles. And outlined by our interviews, it was that there's little opportunity to actually engage in decision making. It seems that fishers especially do not want to make they want to make their voice heard, but also have a say in decision making. But this seems somehow controversial regarding what I outlined earlier about the union, the FFAW. So another result of our research was the perception that the governance system is already incorporating those earlier mentioned guiding principles, which would be a limiting factor for implementing. And furthermore, the level of cooperation between federal and provincial government need to be enhanced, and the idea of putting more emphasis and strengthening the regional government as well as the outport was mentioned several times. And again, last but not least, the aspects of adjacency must be emphasized, which is another preliminary result of our study. So coming back to the purpose of this study, which was to find out the relevance and benefits of the guidelines, as well as finding out the aspects of an implementation of those guidelines. We found out, as mentioned, that there are a few challenges that need to be overcome. But however, the stakeholders that we interviewed had overall a positive attitude towards the guidelines. and also its guiding principles, of course. But moreover, the interviews outlined more benefits than constraints. And therefore, the guidelines have a potential to be beneficial to Newfoundland because they are relevant for the province and therefore worth implementing. And our main conclusion is actually that the guidelines are a great opportunity for Newfoundland to sustain the valuable inshore fishery sector because it's the backbone of rural coastal communities. And to embrace this opportunity, stakeholders pointed out 3 steps that should be taken before implementing. So those are the 3 steps, and by the way, they are not ranked. Stakeholders that we interview agreed on the importance of the principles and see the need of a coherent approach to the guidelines, resulting in the need of a multi-level stakeholder commitment. Moreover, they do see the need of establishing a steering group, as well as the decentralization of decision-making, as mentioned earlier. And with this, I would like to close the presentation and thank you. We thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And so we have a few minutes for any questions now that you wanted clarified, folks here in the room in St. John's, or if you're in the room in Corner Brook, or if you're viewing online on the web. Use the chat to ask questions if you're online. And I'm going to hand the mic to Taylor. If you're in the room here, you need to use the mic, not to hear each other here, but for people online to hear you. So any questions? Okay, and Taylor will get the mic to you.
Yeah, I think it might benefit if we could hear the current statistic on small-scale fisheries in Newfoundland. Boat fleet under 35 or 40, whatever it would be now.
Unfortunately, we don't have it. No, not right now. I'm sorry, but it would be good to see. Yeah, actually.
It's very high. Well, this is the thing. So, okay, this is an interesting point, isn't it? Because around the world we're trying to do the same thing. What do we know about small-scale fisheries? And we face that challenge. We have a hard time figuring out how many people are involved, how many, what they look like, and etc. So it's been a challenge, and we also change a little bit of the way we think about inshore fleet, small, and etc. So we're doing our best in terms of, we definitely recognize the need to have that statistics available. And that would be something that we probably should have some conversation about. And if you were to look at some of the topics that is about the guidelines, we definitely can speak to that in terms of the need to have the information and make the information available.
So how did you think about small? What was your definition of operational?
And Razana, you can repeat the question so people online.
Right. So what do we consider as small-scale fisheries? So that's a question. So if you were to notice that in the guidelines, we actually do not put one definition just because they vary from place to place. And that's also what our research shows. In our consideration, we have thought of small-scale fisheries as under 40. Okay, so that's what we have been talking about. You used to be under 35, and sometimes somebody said 40, but to us that would be what we are talking about. But it's not just about the size alone. If you were to think about, the real essence of what small-scale fisheries mean, it is a lot to do with how they embed in the society, its own operator, the many, many other characteristics of small-scale fisheries that we would consider as we go from place to place.
We've got a question online here, actually. So to what extent the people that you approached while you're doing the research, what % of those people were aware of the guidelines existing?
How many microphones do you use?
All 3 are live.
So the question was how many people were aware of the guidelines, right? So it was 49%, which we've 49% were aware of the guidelines and have heard about the guidelines before. Did that answer the question?
In the context of what is considered inshore in Newfoundland and Labrador, generally in full context, up to 65 feet is considered owner-operator, and inshore vessels in Newfoundland, Labrador. There are about 3,000 inshore licenses, employing between 8 and 10,000 people. So those are fairly tangible numbers drawn out of thin air, but those are approximate numbers if you guys want to know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And I guess, like I said, we should not be, I mean, we're totally comfortable with what works in the province in terms of the definition. Just wanted to make sure that when we look at small scale fisheries, when people think about inshore small scale fisheries, they would add other characteristics to the size and scale. So that would be something that we could think a little bit more about as
well. The harvesting sector of our industry, of course, is controlled out of Ottawa. And so I would be interested in knowing what is Ottawa's stance. And I'm not asking did Ottawa sign, because a signature is easy. But is there real commitment on the part of Ottawa with regard to the guidelines?
The signature was not very easy to get, by the way, just so that you know. But now that we have the signature, indeed, I think, I mean, this is a thing, right? It's not just Canada. Governments around the world could use whatever, could take whatever position. Some of them would say, well, we're already doing well. There's no need to do more. And some of them might actually recognize that it's challenging to implement the guidelines because of the kind of principles and things that are in it. So I think the opportunity for us would be to really bring the conversation as much as we can from around the coast and in all three oceans of Canada, and really have a good conversation with the governments at all levels. And I'm not talking only about governments alone. It should be other governing actors that are involved or should be part of the conversation. So I guess, something that is very interesting for us, actually, people say, well, you want us to implement it. What do you want us to do exactly, right, in implementing the guidelines? So this is why this session is so important, because unless we are able to speak more concretely about what is it that we can really implement, it will be very difficult to try to get any commitment.
I have two quick questions, I hope. Thank you, sir. Could one of you break down for me the 49-51? Like, was it everybody, or did 51% of policymakers know about it? Because if you want to change something, you got to know who your audience is. And also, my second question is, did people think the FFAW was good or bad? You made a reference to something around. That might be too long an answer, but. Yep.
No, okay, we can. I can take the first question though. I can just say that fish harvesters we interview had no knowledge about the guidelines, and the level of awareness through the other two groups was some did of course know, and some did not. So that was a. Yeah. If that answers your question.
Yeah. Well, I'll add something to that. Of the 4,000 people that were consulted, I mean, I didn't present this map, but basically Canada was not one of the countries that these guidelines were consulted. And simply because when we have consultation, it's the community or the civil society organizations that help organize these. So we have places around the world that people are mobilized and organized and want to talk about the guidelines, and that consultation basically didn't happen in Canada, so it's not surprising. Of course, from our research perspective, we have been talking a lot about it, and we always have conversation. But there's people that we have an opportunity to have conversation with about this research. They basically may not have heard about it, but the most important thing is once we started to talk about it, they're all in agreement about how these guidelines could really benefit small-scale fisheries in the province. The second question.
was about the FFAW, right?
Speak to the microphone.
I do have the
Oh, okay,
microphone.
sorry.
It was fairly spread between or among our stakeholders. It was not that one stakeholder group just said negative things about the FFAW. They do see that the FFAW is an organization which brings the voice from the fish harvesters forward. It's their organization, and they want to speak to the union to bring up their ideas and what they want to change in the fisheries or what new ideas they might have. So when we sometimes talk to people, of course, it depended on the situation. For example, I guess you do remember the Area 6 when we talked to some fishermen about the shrimp crisis. So of course it's their livelihood. They are worried about it, but they do see the need of a union to have a say and bring on their ideas and opinions.